All right, so joining us now is John Monaghan, who, Al, I believe you and John might actually know each other.
Just a little bit, a couple of times. Yeah, we're brothers-in-law, brother-in-laws. I don't know.
I think either might be accepted.
We're brothers. I hate the whole in-law thing, man. Yeah. To be honest, man, it's like we're brothers. We're family.
That's right.
Yeah. So there you go.
And John, we've spoken before, you and Al and I, but your story is just really incredible, and I thank you so much for joining us here and sharing, being willing to share with us your experience. You've been a state trooper, I believe, I recall from our last conversation, as well as chief of police in more than one town in the greater New England area, New Hampshire, Massachusetts.
New Hampshire. Yeah.
New Hampshire. Okay. And eventually you retired to work at first on criminal justice reform, and then now you work with an organization called All Aces out of Boston.
Yeah, All Aces Inc.
Yeah, what's the website?
All Aces Inc. INC.
Oh, okay, All Aces Inc. And we'll throw the website up there. And All Aces does work with racial equality, diversity, and inclusion across all spectrums. So first, maybe do you want to start off by telling us about your experience, how you started out originally as in law enforcement?
Sure. Yeah, it's a kind of a funny story. So I went to forestry school up in northern Vermont and lived in northern New England. I'm from Massachusetts. I was born down on the Cape, but I moved up there. I graduated in '89, and I was up there in the '90s. And never wanted to go back. I love the woods. I absolutely loved it up there. And then at some point I started training in martial arts, and I really liked that a lot too. And I just did whatever odd jobs I could do. And that was super fun for me. And then I had a kid, and I was like, wow, I have to get a real job. Like these things require food and stuff like that, and medical insurance. So I was looking around, like, what can I do? And up north, you could be a logger or a farmer, or like maybe work at one of the very few retail or something like that. And I also had been training as a healer. Actually, I studied shiatsu. I studied with an acupuncturist, and to balance out sort of the healing part of martial arts. And so I saw this ad in the paper for Lebanon Police Department, and I was like, wow, I wonder if I could like be calm amongst like conflict and stuff that's scary. Like, can I kind of maintain this martial spirit? And so I literally had no desire to be a cop, but just went down and applied. It paid better than I had ever been paid in my life with medical and dental benefits. So I was like, I'm going to try it.
Yeah.
And it stuck, and I did it. And I ended up going and being a trooper. I covered a really rural area of northern New Hampshire. It's referred to as Patrol 5. It had 9 towns, and only 2 of them had police departments. So I did all sorts of stuff. So those mean guys that pull you over on the side of the highway, I was not that guy. I was doing burglaries and rapes and all sorts of crazy stuff in way up north, breaking up domestics. And I really started to see my industry, policing as a place that needed change organizationally. So I went to school and got a master's degree in organizational leadership and management. Really in retrospect, I think my frustration with the state police was that it does have some elements of oppression within it, and we can talk about it later. But oftentimes when we talk about racism and systems of oppression, we think of it as affecting only minorities or we would call them priority populations or underrepresented people, but it really affects everyone, just differently and more disproportionately. So I was like, you know what, screw it. I'm going to go be the chief of police somewhere. So I found this little tiny town in northern New Hampshire that had a police shooting like 5 years before, and they really were ripped apart. And I was like, I'm gonna put this town back together. I'm gonna regain some faith and trust and humanity in this place. And I was bound and determined to do it. So I became the chief in this town called Franconia. It's up in Franconia Notch, if you've ever been up there. And that's where I met my wife, and that's how I ended up becoming Alan's brother-in-law. And and that's where I cut my teeth as far as like, how do you reach into a community and, and really be part of its heart and soul. And so that's kind of what got me into racial equity work. Although New Hampshire's a very white state, I was that's when Black Lives Matter and all the shootings were coming to light, partially because of the internet and people being able to post it, something that's been happening for a long time. But it pulled the curtain back, and I was like, I am not going to stand by. If my profession's doing this, I'm going to make a difference. And so that's how I got into racial equity work. It's a long a long road into your question, but that's the meat of it.
I think you actually described that pretty concisely, which must not have been an easy thing to do. I mean, I'm sure you were met with a lot of questions and people not understanding, or even maybe some feelings of betrayal, I don't know, by other, law enforcement when you decided to leave, or not so much. Did you not really experience that?
Yeah, well, there's people who benefit from those systems. There's people who are in power because of those systems. And when you question it, you question their power. And there's people who get their identity from belonging to those systems. And if that system doesn't exist, what am I? A threat to their own personal identity. So, for me to question things and say, why are we doing it this way? And oftentimes you hear, because we've always done it that way, which is like the worst answer ever. And so, and the most common. So I was well respected because I wasn't afraid of stuff. I mean, I was afraid, but I do things that were hard. I wasn't afraid to go into dangerous situations. So I kind of like held my own. I had a lot of street credibility. But I also, as far as my philosophy and questioning things, that's part of why I wasn't like on the fast track to promotion, because if you really look into it, I was a critical thinker. And that's part of the problem that we see today is people who are willing to just say, well, why do we do what we do? Why do we believe what we believe? And do I really fit into this, instead of just going upstream with all the other fish? It's important to go to the beat of your own drum. It's a metaphor Apple would like.
So you went from being the police chief in one town or multiple towns?
I was a police chief in Franconia, and I didn't finish my story. So I was there for about 5.5 years. And then I ended up going to a town in the Lakes region of New Hampshire called Moultonborough. And I worked there for a couple of years before I retired. So I got the amount of time I had worked and my age, I was old enough to be able to retire. So, and I during that time, I started to I just started to educate myself about racism and especially its intersection with law enforcement. And I was fortunate enough to go through a learning cohort. They call it an affinity group. It was for white people to learn about racism, because we shouldn't put that burden on the Black or BIPOC community to expect those folks to educate us. So I went through that, which plugged me into the New Hampshire Endowment for Health, and they do a lot of work in what's called a race and equity series. And I was part of their criminal justice reform work group. And that's sort of how I started to do criminal justice reform work. And then when I was able to retire, I knew that that's what I wanted to do full time. I wanted to do racial equity work and social justice work.
I was just going to ask how you got involved with All Aces, and if you could tell us a little bit about what All Aces does.
Sure. So it's another long story. And Kunj, did I answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I was also kind of just wondering what, if you went to that town to try to heal the town and you found that you were pretty successful in doing so.
Yeah.
and then you went to another town and worked there as well, and then eventually retired. Did you find that working from the inside, was there something that made you say, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. I want to focus on, like, was there something that happened? Was there just a general thing over time? Was there, what made the abrupt change to basically quote unquote the other side,
Yeah.
but not really the other side. We're all on the same side, but.
Right. So I'm going to answer both your questions. So Kunj, what happened is I had, as much as I did training in my own department, I had a racist incident happen there with my only black employee, and I was mortified. I was really upset by it, and I worked really hard to fix it, and I worked with him to do everything I could to make it right. And what I found is that when I was working, I told the town about it. And when I worked with them, my message wasn't getting through to the people who were making the decisions about what should happen. You have a certain amount of authority as a police chief, and then it defaults to like select boards or mayors or town managers in certain towns. So as I was piping this information up about this incident I had, it got back to me that it wasn't getting through, and I realized that I was working in a system that wasn't going to support me in doing what was so crucial to not just our community, but even within our town politics and our town employment. And so I was frustrated, and I was like, I'm not working for a place that's not going to be aligned with my own morals and values. And so I had enough time in, and so I sort of out of protest, let them know that this is why I was leaving, and make sure that employee was taken care of, and is hugely successful there, by the way.
What was that last one?
Yeah, so he was hugely he's very successful now where he's moved to. Yeah, so that was and it was fairly abrupt, so when I made that decision, I voted with my feet. So your other question was, how did I come to all aces? And so you should know this. Here's the little seed I'm going to plant before I tell my story and water it. I grew up in Attleboro, Mass, and then in high school I moved to Cape Cod. So I went from this like blue collar Irish Catholic town to a place where the hippies went to retire after the 60s, down on the Lower Cape. And I had these wonderful teachers who I had never experienced adults like this before. And they were the ones who protested in the 60s. They got me and a lot of my classmates excited about social justice causes. Back then, it was like apartheid and things that were wrong with the world. We had the Cold War still then. And we actually hosted some Russian delegates to come talk to us. Like, let's not make them scary monsters, but let's see them as humans. And so I had this like social justice seed planted in me. I went through my career. I was in this town in the Lakes region, and I was trying to figure out, like, how can I bring this town together? They didn't have the same issues that Franconia had, but they were definitely bifurcated in many ways. I think part of it was geography, part of it was the disparity in wealth with this town. And so it's a stupid story in some ways, but I saw online these stickers, and they're called, and it just said neighbor. And it was this organization called the Nantucket Project. They're based out of Connecticut, but they host this conference on Nantucket every year. And I said, can I get some of these stickers to stick on my cruiser? And because I just wanted people to start seeing us as their neighbor and maybe seeing each other as their neighbor. Because I think if we can see each other as humans and see the humanity in one another, many of these issues we're dealing with will go away. So I got these stickers. Well, little did I know they're also a filmmaking company. And so they were like, hey, we'll get you the stickers, but we also want to talk to you. So they ended up coming up and taking some film, and they made a short film about me and a couple of folks that I work with. And so there's a small documentary called The Box by the Nantucket Project. And I mean, it's like 10 minutes long. It's not that great.
It's amazing. Dude, it's awesome. It's awesome.
Al's
Come on,
seen
dude.
it.
Come on. It's awesome. It's awesome.
So, and what we're talking about in the film is like how hard this career can be, and how because of this like macho society we live in, and the macho-ness of the profession, that people don't talk about the damage it can do to you, you know. And a couple of my friends like opened up, and they were like, this is the hardship that I faced, and I found it really hard to raise my hand and say I need help, knowing I would be ostracized by my peers. And sure enough, one of them was. And on the other hand, one wasn't, you know, and he had a really hard time. You know, his wife had committed suicide, and some other stuff to do with his kids. And his town and community really embraced him and helped him through that hard time. And the film is really about when we stand up and we're saying, hey, you know what, I'm a little different. I got this thing going on that maybe doesn't fit. Are you kicked out or are you embraced? And so that's what the film was all about. So I went to Nantucket, talking with this woman named Atia Martin, who's the founder of, not even co-founder, she's the founder of All Aces Inc. She's the former chief resiliency officer for the city of Boston. And and so we're talking about like social justice. I tell her the story about growing up on Cape Cod and Russian delegates and apartheid and, you know, and all these things. And then they play this film, and she didn't know that I was in it. She was like, wait, you're a cop? She's like, that doesn't even make sense. Like how can you be all about social justice stuff and be a cop? And so we talked more. We talked like we're talking now. And she basically was like, listen, when you retire, let's talk. And so, you know, I literally up and quit my job. Like, I don't even know what I'm going to go do next. And I just felt so strongly about it. And so I talked to her, and she was like, she's like, I got you, man. I got you. She's like, come work for me. So she gave me a home, and I very much needed one. And I'm so grateful.
So what exactly does All Aces do for people who don't really know?
Yeah. So we work for like profit, nonprofit, government. And the cool thing about it is we do racial equity work, diversity, inclusion, all across the board. The thing I like about it the most, you know, because a lot of people talk about like implicit bias and that kind of stuff. And we really look at it as like, if you can like develop yourself as a person, and so like you figure out who you want to be, you have a group of people who you're close with that figures out who they want to be, and together you can figure out how you want to get there. You start to have like agency, and you're learning about and working on racism issues. You can really develop as a human, and you as a group with agency, and you as an individual with agency can really make a difference in making sure that we tear down some of these systems of oppression, and you can really make an impact on the world. You know, instead of just learning all the right words and calling people out, it's really about finding yourself in the conversation of race and racial equity, and having some like some room to move, some skills and tools to get some work done, and some good people to support you in this effort. So that's like kind of what we do. And so it's more of a process, you know. I think racial equity work is a journey. It's not like a HR box that you do your 8-hour workshop, you check the box, everybody's woke now and let's move on. But it's about looking at like, why are things organized the way they're organized? Finding a place in the story.
Yeah.
Go back to when you were working with the police. Did you find, like, what were some of the racial disparities and issues that you saw from the inside? Because we almost never get an inside view from the actual police of how they saw racial issues, you know, firsthand. And can you give us some insight into any of those, and maybe some examples of any disparities that you saw or didn't see that people are calling out now?
I think one of the hardest parts is that how it shows up in police departments varies depending on where you are. Like Southern racism is kind of different than Northern racism. And so in police departments, I feel like it's like because we carry weapons and deal with conflict, like it's way more visible than like when it happens at a school or when it happens in housing, when you're trying to, get an apartment or buy a house, or when it happens in healthcare, when you're not getting the care that you need. It shows up everywhere. It just shows up really awful and violently on the street in public when it's policing. So there's that. I'll just say that in general, that and it bothers me when I hear people like cops are racist, because we're no more racist than a firefighter or a doctor or a lawyer. However, I will also say this, that if you want a brief history lesson, I don't know, briefly. So so there's a reason like everything is the way it is. And it starts back in 1619 when the first enslaved people were brought here, that there's been people making decisions about who gets what, and they were not the enslaved people. They were not black people that could make those decisions, that allowed for certain things. And some of the stuff more recently, is like in the early part of the 19th century, was in the, like, especially like in the 40s and 50s, was a thing called redlining. Some of you all probably know about it, right? Who gets to live where? It was written into like the federal laws about who gets a mortgage in these neighborhoods and who doesn't. And so that's why we see like inner city neighborhoods that are predominantly black, and then we see white people in the suburbs because the government allowed for that. And so I also believe that because of the disparity, so the civil rights movement did a lot of good. It stopped a lot of problems. It stopped certain practices, but it didn't fix the damage those practices did. And so even though they said there's no more redlining, well, you still had a really poor neighborhood in the inner city, like, because now you can join unions. Like, unions can't exclude you because of the color of your skin. It didn't change the social and economic demographics of that area. And so there was more crime, and crime is not a race thing. Crime is like usually a poverty thing. There's more crime and poverty because people have a scarcity mindset. And so they make worse decisions and they, harm each other more often. It's just the way it is. So, and I'm not a sociologist, but, and so I think what happened is that, I don't know, I wouldn't even call it well-meaning. I'll just say that police executives, who, in my opinion, need a lot more training than they get, were making decisions, policy decisions about how to deal with this this crime. And instead of saying, well, the root of the problem is because of this 400-year history we have of oppression and neglect and abuse, instead of looking at it as perhaps a health crisis in many instances, they were like, well, we're just going to stop questioning and frisking people. And so you had these heavy-handed police tactics that were disproportionately used in these communities because that's where the more crime was. And so it unfairly targeted people of color, right? That's racism. And it was part of a system. So now it's systemic racism. And I would say that the cops doing it may have started their careers well-meaning and wanting to help people, but quickly learned in those systems, if you want to get promoted, you're going to be the guy that makes the most arrests. You're going to be the guy that gets the most drugs, the most guns. You're going to be the guy that does. So you're the one who's more heavy-handed. You're the one who perhaps start breaking the rules. And you're the one who, and so this system becomes a racist system because it disproportionately affects these groups of people, and it's rewarded by the system because those folks get promoted. And quite frankly, those folks end up rising through the ranks and being the ones in charge. And I don't think they ever question along the way, like, why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we harming these people? And statistically, there's maybe 5 or 10% of the people that commit crimes in those neighborhoods. And yet, we're blanket patting and frisking most of these folks, not grandma, not the little kids on their way to school, not all the girls, but, and so now you've got this demographic of black men, probably, 14 to 40 something, who are just being hammered by these people looking for a crime that 90% of the time isn't there, and so now you've just pissed a lot of people off for decades. And then you go and shoot the wrong person and you wonder why there's protests. That's why.
Right. I just like, so yeah, you're talking about systemic, problems within throughout. Like how does that? And of course, you're saying people rise to the top who are just like, they're just towing the line. They're just doing the job. They're just doing the job. They don't ask questions. Maybe they know right from wrong, but like I always used to think that, man, with education comes, with knowledge, with education comes a sense of decency, I guess. And not, of course, that's a blanket statement, but how like you being in it and seeing it from the inside, now on the outside, like how literally, man, and then we talk about defund the police, and we'll get to it, which is a term that I personally I don't like. It's and we'll get into that. But how, like, man, seriously, how can it change? You know what I'm saying? Like, we always talk about, like, man, well, there's not, obviously, like, in a lot of communities talking about, stop and frisk and this and that. Most of those cops don't live in those neighborhoods. You know what I'm saying? So they're not invested in anybody on the street. Like any part of the community. So how does that change? And then on top of that, you're like you said, you stop and frisk a majority of these young black men, for instance, who could possibly be really good recruits for the job. But after a couple of times of that, man, like, why would they want to, go into law enforcement? Like, I know a few brothers who did, and I'm glad they did, but that is a small number, very small number. And then the amount of BS that they had to deal with once in it's amazing that they're still at it, Mm-hmm. But anyway, I'm sorry, it's a lot there, but I'm just always curious, man. Just like, we talk about the defund the police and all this kind of stuff, when I don't know if that's really getting to the root of the problem.
Yeah. So being from where you police is important, I think. I've also appreciated living in the next town over at times, because for me, at least as a chief, it was nice to have sort of a mental and emotional break. And because that helped my mental health, so I could return refreshed and rejuvenated. So I think looking at our recruit, like, who are we getting to come in? Are they people with degrees in psychology and sociology, and do they understand how the human mind works, and like the term defund the police is, so there's certain terms like toxic masculinity, white privilege, and defund the police that all land really badly on the very people that need to hear them most. So, and I always say this, I teach some classes and I'm like, those terms are horrible, but what they mean is not horrible. So, I don't know when it happened. I remember being taught about it at the police academy. There's a lawsuit because we used to do what's called warehousing people with mental illness. We would just stick them all in homes, and they didn't get to live amongst us. And at some point, someone was like, a lawyer, of course, or several, was like, you know what, that's not fair. It's an unconstitutional seizure of these people's, freedom. And so they sued, and sure enough, they won. And so they were, if you have mental illness, you are not necessarily, unless you're a threat to yourself or someone else, you can walk amongst us. What they didn't do is fund it. And so there's a lot of untreated mental illness walking around out there. And who do you call when somebody's acting in a way that's not like normal? You call the police. And we have poor training, and so we deal with it poorly. And so the defund the police is really calling for funding mental health and well-being and substance abuse issues.
That's what I was going to say about Al's question about defund the police and the name scaring people off, possibly misrepresenting it, is I think people are confused. I mean, if you're on the far, end of no, we need more law and order, it's of course scary to you, and that's a deal breaker right there. If you're in the middle and you understand that there are things that need to be reformed, or people need to be better qualified to handle different types of situations within the police department, traffic, drug issues, mental illness, domestic violence, they get confused of, well, wait, why would we take money out when really it's going to take an investment to specialize and train people? So I think that's where a lot of confusion happens.
Yeah. There had been a lot of so it depends who you're talking to about it. Like the people who came up with the idea probably understand the depth of it pretty well, but the people who are more militant about it, so I always say you can't fight oppression with oppression. And so, sometimes when you're dealing with folks who are early in on their social justice journey, they've got a lot of passion, but maybe not as much knowledge as they should have. And so they know the right things to say, but they don't know exactly why they're saying them sometimes. And so, and you get two people who are in that exact same journey on polar opposite ends. And that's not good. If you're like back the blue and then you're like defund the police, like those two folks probably shouldn't be in the same room together.
Right.
So it takes people who have some depth to be able to really deconstruct and have a good conversation about, what are things that we need to do to make a more fair and equitable society. And I talked a little earlier, like mental health and substance abuse, those are health issues, those are health crisis issues that we're saddling police departments to deal with, and they're ill-equipped to do it. But I think if we just copycat stuff and don't have some real intellects and some real groundbreakers, keep continuing to move the ball forward and make things better, just like music. I mean, you guys are, if you play the same thing over and over again, you get what you've always gotten, but if you have people who can think differently, be creative, and back it up with so here's the thing, backing it up with research and statistics and proving. So there's an organization in New York out of John Jay College called Center for Policing Equity, and they measure stuff. And they're like, we are going to statistically figure out what the problem is, and we're going to come up with ways to solve it, and we're going to measure it, and we're going to prove it. And if it works, we're going to do it again, and then we're going to measure it, and we're going to make it better. And I think that is woefully missing in my profession, or this profession, the profession I no longer partake in. But, I just don't think, if you're going to invest there. But stop throwing money at SWAT trucks and stuff. Give that money to healthcare providers, and fund people who are reaching out into those communities that are so underserved, and help them, deal with the health crises that they're having. Fund that, absolutely fund that. And at the end of the day, you might not need to pay as much money for police because you've gotten rid of half the problems that are there anyways. Defund the police doesn't sound great, because if you're worried about being burglarized or raped, you really don't want, half the amount of protection out there, but so it's really how you frame the problem and talk about it.
Well, such complex issues, and your insight is unlike any other I've heard, John. So thank you.
Man, dude, you know how much I love you, man. And I really wish, there were more people out there thinking the way you, just like you, man. It'd be,
well, thanks.
We're getting there. We're getting there, man.
I work in these circles because I feel like, it's my job, if not anybody's, to do something about it. And I think that if more people had the courage to speak up, that we would find that there's a lot of quiet voices out there that need to be heard. So I love you too, Al.
Yeah.
Well, I feel the same way. I really appreciate your insight. And
thanks, Kunj. Yeah, Dave, thank you. It was great. It was great to talk with you. It's great to be here. Thanks for letting me be in the spotlight. So.
Absolutely, our pleasure.
Yeah,
we have a little break from the spotlight right now, us musicians. So we're happy.
Right. I know. Your industry is taking a beating.
Well, that's why we're using our time for other good things. So thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Yeah. Later.